Hold the Line with Mike Solan is brought to you by the Seattle Police Officers Guild, Seattle's public safety voice.
Hey, welcome back to Hold the Line with Mike Solan. In studio, Bob Scales is back again. You remember him from episode 30. Check it out, link in the description. We are going to unpack Judge Robart, the federal judge that released the City of Seattle from the Department of Justice settlement agreement / consent decree. Stick around.
The line must be drawn here. This far, no farther.
This is where we hold them. This is where we fight.
We will not go quietly into the night. We will not vanish. Not a fight. Hold the line!
Bob, welcome back, buddy.
Thanks. Always good to be here.
And it's a pleasure to have you here because you are the man, the subject matter expert when it comes to Department of Justice consent decrees over police departments. Obviously, we had you on with us episode 30 where we talked about Seattle's, Department of Justice experience, to say the least. And here we are, man. We are, a couple days ago, Judge Robart said Seattle is done. So what are your thoughts? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? My opinion, it's good because we're finally out from underneath the DOJ. In the city of Seattle, the constituents gets their police department back after close to 14 years, north of $220 million invested to get us to this point. Multiple, experiences in terms of, hey, we were almost here 5 years ago at 2020. We were this close to being done. And then Floyd happens, and then here we are 5 years later. So what are your thoughts, man?
Well, it's obviously good to be out of a consent decree and no longer reporting to a judge and a federal monitor. The problem is that Seattle never should have been under a consent decree to begin with. The whole thing was based on a fraud. And that fraud cost local taxpayers almost $250 million, and cost public safety. It cost officer morale. It cost leadership in the city. It has spawned corrupt systems that are now running the city and the department. And it's all because the DOJ claimed that Seattle PD had a pattern or practice of unconstitutional force. And that was a lie. And there was absolutely no evidence for that, which is why the DOJ refused to provide us with the evidence when we asked for it.
Yeah, and so that goes back to 2011, and they claimed 20% of the time we engage in unconstitutional policing, i.e. force, particularly when it comes to racial discrimination. And then more importantly, the broad data, leap into police force that, to your point, didn't exist.
Right. So the DOJ started their investigation in March of 2011, and I was in the city attorney's office and selected to represent the city during the investigation. And we were an open book because we thought, hey, we're doing everything right. And we've got the best policies, we've got the best training. We're constantly being praised by the federal government and National Institute of Justice as a progressive department that's doing everything right. We had de-escalation training, crisis intervention teams before it was the thing to do.
That's right. We led the nation
Absolutely.
on crisis intervention. I believe that started in 2008.
Absolutely. And demonstration management. After the WTO, the amount of training and research and development that went into the department's demonstration management policies and training was unsurpassed.
Second to none.
And I mean, I remember talking to the command staff back in the early 2000s. They said, look, people are coming from around the world to learn how we deal with demonstrations. And you had a lot of demonstrations, Mardi Gras, N30, Occupy Wall Street, May Day. I mean, there were demonstrations all the time. And they were uneventful because Seattle PD knew how to handle them. That was before the consent decree. What the consent decree did was essentially wipe out all of your institutional knowledge. It wiped out all your policies. It wiped out all your training. And it said, you got to start from scratch. Because not only do you have to start from scratch, but you have to do what the DOJ lawyers and the monitor team tells you to do and the judge tells you to do, not best practices, not evidence-based. It's just what we want. And so the other thing that is the fraudulent aspect of all this is that the federal government only has jurisdiction over local law enforcement if they prove in court by a preponderance of the evidence that a department has a pattern or practice of unconstitutional policing. That was a statute, 42 U.S.C. 14141, that was passed in 1994 after the Rodney King trials. And so the federal government had no business being here because they never provided any evidence and they never proved that Seattle PD had a pattern or practice of unconstitutional policing. But they used political pressure and public pressure and media pressure to convince local elected officials to sign a consent decree saying, we're going to turn over everything to the federal judge and the federal monitor and DOJ attorneys for as long as it takes to do whatever they tell us to do. And that's what happened in Seattle.
Yeah.
So 13 years.
And it's an incredible amount of time, unbelievable amount of money thrown at this thing. And I was in the courtroom on the 3rd this week, a couple of days ago, and I'm watching this play out. Courtroom's packed. It's the who's who of Seattle brass in terms of police department officials. It's the legal people. The mayor was there. Obviously, Chief Barnes. The city attorney, Ann Davison, was there. Then you had media and a few other community members and U.S. attorneys. And Robart gets there, and he's very difficult to hear. And I wasn't impressed with his just demeanor of how he handled things. And he wasn't remiss on throwing shade at people that questioned the consent decree. He mentioned John Diaz, certain people in the city's office, and he mentioned broadly others that questioned why the consent decree should not have been here in the first place. And I thought that was interesting because he was defending his position 13 years later and how the calamity that it is played out. But it is a positive that they're gone. Would you agree?
Yeah, and in terms of the criticism that Judge Robart had for people that questioned the validity of the consent decree and the efficacy of the consent decree, it appears that Judge Robart's unfamiliar with the First Amendment because there's nothing in the consent decree that says that you cannot criticize it, that you cannot criticize the monitor, that you cannot criticize the judge. But that was my experience. If we said anything that wasn't rah, 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 you're so wonderful, we're so happy you're here, we'll do whatever you say. If we questioned, all we had to do was question something, and all of a sudden, we were obstructing.
That's right.
We were obstructing the process.
You're painted as the conspiracy theorists, the people that are holding back accountability.
Absolutely. I mean, that was it. I mean, that was the former monitor, Merrick Bob would always talk about the troglodytes. He actually used that term in his report. Troglodytes that are opposed to reform. And he was referring to essentially anybody on the command staff or an SPD that would criticize him or the consent decree. And there's a lot of criticism of the monitor early on, particularly with his billing practices.
Sure.
And he didn't like that.
That's what I noticed, Bob, is that people that are in these positions of authority, if you will, don't like to be questioned. And I think their ego is front and center. And anybody that questions, they malign, besmirch, paint in a category that is almost unhuman. And to me, you're not professional enough to stand by your product to justify why your product is what it is. I mean, you've done an excellent job pushing back on this. And I think those that Robart threw under the bus a few days ago are standing up for an agency that really was emblematic of what you described SPD to be during that time frame. Really professional, led the nation in terms of, I think, progressive policing, ideas, concepts. Others were flying here to learn from us, right? Not saying that we were perfect. Definitely any profession that has a human component to it, there's going to be things that happen. But that doesn't paint this department, nor broadly agencies across the nation, as being problematic, thus warranting a consent decree, Department of Justice to come in and completely take over for political purposes.
Yeah, I think the reason that the judge and the monitor and DOJ officials were so sensitive about criticism is because they knew that what they were doing was wrong. And they didn't want to be exposed.
It's crazy.
They absolutely knew that Seattle PD did not have a pattern of practice.
So then why okay, and I know we unpacked this in episode 30, but then why do it? Why would they embark on this now close to 14 years later, north of $220 million the taxpayers had to pay these people? Why do it?
Well, it's interesting because the DOJ, and obviously the DOJ has changed a lot under the Trump administration. They're taking a very different stance. But all prior administrations, from Clinton to Bush to Obama to Biden, right? The Civil Rights Division and pattern of practice investigations all work basically the same way. And there are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the country, and fewer than 50 consent decrees, and probably less than 100 pattern practice investigations. So a very small number over the last 30 years. And the DOJ never publishes anything about consent decrees. So we don't know the criteria that DOJ uses to select a department. We don't know why Seattle was chosen for investigation and a consent decree. No one knows. Seattle was investigated at the same time that Austin PD was. There's never been a consent decree in Texas, by the way. Seattle got a consent decree. Austin PD, that was objectively much worse. They had a ton of officer-involved shootings at that time. Objectively much worse. They had officers who were being charged with crimes, and they got a technical assistance letter, which is just a letter saying, oh, here's some suggestions we think you can do better. And Seattle got a 13-year consent decree. Why is that? DOJ could never explain that. They just said, oh, every city is different, da-da-da-da-da. So my feeling is that consent decrees, both in terms of who gets investigated and who gets the consent decree, et cetera, is 100% political, 100%, because there's no evidence behind it. So typically what happens is you have a high-profile incident. In Seattle, it was John T. Williams. In Minneapolis, it was George Floyd. In Ferguson, it was Michael Brown. You can go on the list. In Louisville, it's Breonna Taylor, right? So you have a high-profile incident. That brings a lot of national attention and media attention that riles up all the activists and the ACLU, et cetera. We got to do something about the police department. So the Civil Rights Division comes in and starts working with the activists, and it's like, all right, well, we can really get things under control if we do a consent decree. So we'll gather all this community support, and basically they'll trash the department. If you ever read a pattern or practice finding letter, which are usually unsigned, they don't identify the evidence, they don't identify their experts, but they just trash the department. I mean, you can look at Phoenix's findings letter. They trash them like Phoenix is doing everything wrong. Minneapolis doing everything wrong. Seattle was just doing use of force wrong. They did more in one letter to destroy police community relations in Seattle than any incident. Intentionally, yeah. It's designed to create a divide. The DOJ comes in, they divide, and then they conquer, and then they claim victory, and they say, "Oh, because of us, now everybody's together."
Yeah.
And it's interesting that what I've read is that there were no community members, there were no community activists or anything at the press conferences and so forth. And the ACLU has come out with a very strongly worded letter saying, "Hey, Seattle's not fully reformed. Seattle still has problems.
Well, see,
and
here,
so forth.
and that spawns me to just opine on that. They're always going to take that position.
Yeah, right.
And I also think that policing in general, you should always strive for the best product out there. Right.
Well, also, there are always going to be, this is the other thing, there are always going to be problems in policing. There is no police department that's perfect.
Absolutely.
Right? And that's very different than a police department that has a pattern or practice of unconstitutional policing. What that means is that it's not an individual incident. It's not individual officers. It's that the department is so bad that your policies and your training and your leadership create an environment that encourages and condones unconstitutional policing. That's what it means.
Yeah, and it completely throws under the bus all the officers that actually work for the agency. And then it goes into, our press release here that we put out on the day, September 3rd. You can find a link in the description. I'll just briefly go over it. It's basically saying that we're thankful that they're gone. Just paraphrasing some of this. The line officers and sergeants of the Seattle Police Officers Guild emphatically welcome Judge Robart's decision to terminate the 14-year-long saga. And I basically say that the weaponized financial grift that is the Department of Justice consent decree process is finally over. It's over for the cops, the citizens, but also for those who profited from this process. Seattle taxpayers no longer must bear the financial DOJ consent decree burden, now over $220 million. We talk about overly burdensome policy restrictions that are still in place, if you will, within the Seattle Police Department, even after they're gone. And basically says we actually support Department of Justice consent decrees. We do. And our national group, United Coalition of Public Safety, which I think is leading the charge on reforming, not to use the word reform too much because they say we need to reform, but we want the consent decree process to be reformed on a national level because the way it was been used has been in the past and was for Seattle's consent decree, politically motivated. And that's our problem. We have no problem as professional police officers holding ourselves accountable, although the activists, ACLU and whatnot, will paint us as if we're obstructionists as our police union to accountability. That's completely false. But we support consent decrees as long as they're done properly and they're not weaponized in the future. What say you with that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with a pattern of practice investigation or a consent decree if it's done properly. In fact, you would want, if a department actually had a pattern of practice, if you had policies and training and leadership that condoned and encouraged unconstitutional policing, and they refuse to change, absolutely. Get the feds in here, get them to do an investigation, get them to take them to court, prove it, and put them under a consent decree for as long as it takes to get things fixed. But that never happens. It's generally the more liberal cities, the more progressive police departments where you've got elected officials that are willing to just sign away.
Yeah, they'll bow down to the activist pressure.
They'll sign it away, and they're the ones that get it. And literally, it's just so, like, if you look at the before and after. And I wanted to ask you because you've been here. How long have you been with SPD?
27 years.
Okay, so pretty much half and half, right?
Yes.
So half your career was before, half your career was after. But here's what I saw. So I was with Seattle from 2000 to 2014. So in that time, we had two police chiefs, Gil Kurlikowski, John Diaz.
That's right.
Right? Two police chiefs. And Gil Kurlikowski was about 8 years.
Who went on to work as the drug czar for the Obama administration.
And head of Customs and Border Patrol after that. And so obviously he must have been doing something right in Seattle to get those jobs.
A rising star.
Right? Once the consent decree started in the 13 years, you've had 7 police chiefs.
It's incredible.
And I don't know that any of them were selected after a public process, right? So you've got Jim Pugel, who was interim, Harry Bailey, who was interim, Kathleen O'Toole. So how do we get Kathleen O'Toole? Kathleen O'Toole was picked by the Monitor and DOJ. There was no public process for Kathleen O'Toole.
The federal monitor that oversaw Seattle's consent decree.
Right. And why did they pick Kathleen O'Toole? Well, Kathleen O'Toole was the federal monitor in East Haven, Connecticut. And what is Kathleen O'Toole doing now? She's the federal monitor in Springfield, Massachusetts, making $500,000 a year.
Yeah, there's a bit of a financial connection.
Yeah. And so what does Kathleen O'Toole do? Well, she makes Carmen Best her deputy chief. All right. When O'Toole leaves, Carmen Best becomes
hand selected to be anointed to be the police department chief.
What does Carmen Best do? Well, we have George Floyd and abandon the East Precinct, and then she resigns. What's she doing now? She works for 21CP Solutions. Who's a partner at 21CP Solutions? Kathleen O'Toole. What does 21CP Solutions do? Well, they do a lot of monitoring and consulting for law enforcement agencies. Big money. All right. So then what happens after Carmen Best? Well, then you have Adrian Diaz, who was promoted by Carmen Best. Adrian Diaz comes in. I don't have to talk about all the scandals with Adrian Diaz, who ends up, getting ousted. And then you have Sean Barnes. So how do we get Sean Barnes? Well, was it through a public process? Nope. Is there any community input? Nope. So what happened? Kathleen O'Toole volunteers. She comes back to Seattle and says, I want to volunteer to select your next police chief. And Mayor Harrell says, great. Here's a volunteer. I saw the form. There's a volunteer form. She's, I'm going to comply with all the ethics programs, et cetera. And she checks all the boxes. One of those things is conflicts of interest, which she checked. I'm going to follow the city's conflicts of interest policy. She has a very close relationship with Sean Barnes. They've worked together for many years. Sean Barnes has said publicly, she's one of my closest friends and advisors. She picked Sean Barnes to be your next police chief. And Mayor Harrell rubber stamps that, and now you have Sean Barnes as your chief without any public process, selected by Kathleen O'Toole, who was selected by the DOJ. So essentially you have this leadership vacuum after a consent decree starts. And the monitor and the judge and DOJ attorneys, they run the department. They run it. Yeah. And they have run it. And even the mayor said in his press release and his statements, well, finally we're going to take Seattle PD back for the community. The community's back in charge. And he's absolutely right. It was gone, right? You guys were gone for 13 years. Yeah. Right? There was no community involvement in policing. It was just whatever the feds told you to do.
Well, then, just this sparks my memory here, and I'm going to play another clip here real quick. But then if you look at it started in 2011, formally 2012, right? The consent decree. And then you look at the years before 2020, how the anti-police zealots took control from this vacuum of a consent decree in Seattle, and it went statewide. You're talking about Initiative 940, de-escalation, all of these things that even hammered us more and more and more, and that led to a lot of public safety policies and / state laws that completely hinders our ability to do our jobs. 2020 was basically the escalation of that, and then we're unpacking that calamity now as we move away from 2020. But the damage is done. I mean, you even have the governor of the state wants their own statewide consent decree DOJ process, if you will. 800 lawyers, very litigious, and then it led to a state law. Whenever there's an OIS now, in any portion of the state, there's going to be an investigation team, mix of civilians and former investigators in the police conversation. And so then now, since the audience needs to know that, now since we're out of control, out of DOJ control, I should say, SPD's force investigation team, which handled OIS investigations, no longer can do our own investigations. So now we have to have a regional team come in that will adhere to the state law. They're going to be doing the investigation, and they're not going to be able to do a proper investigation, in my opinion, because they're not going to uphold the officers in terms of their constitutional rights. They're going to ask for a voluntary statement in a criminal investigation. The officers are going to say, no, we're not playing ball. We're going to exercise our Fifth Amendment right. So there's going to be less transparency now because officers have to then protect their bottom line, which is their personal freedom. This is how bad this has gotten. how out of control this has become. Now, Washington State leads the nation in the least amount of officers per capita. All of this started with the anti-police activist control to hammer this profession and reform the criminal justice system.
Yeah, I mean, you just sort of listed, there's so much going on that is bad in Washington State when it comes to public safety and law enforcement, and you know, the legislation is one thing, right? After George Floyd, there was a whole slate of legislation, including banning neck restraints, including, you know, collecting use of force data, creating the Office of Independent Investigations. Everything's failed, right? Every single piece of legislation, limiting vehicle pursuits, every single piece of legislation has failed and produced the opposite impact.
Yes, where criminals are in control.
The opposite impact of what you're trying to do. For example, the legislature banned lateral neck restraints, and which is, you know, I mean, it's not a chokehold, but people refer to it as chokeholds, but it's not a chokehold. And a lot of that was because of what happened to George Floyd, which was not a lateral neck restraint.
Right.
But everybody saw that, and everybody said, "Oh, he was choked to death." And so now they're banning lawful techniques which are safe and used in martial arts for hundreds of years. And so one of the things that I do with my business, Police Strategies LLC, is we help law enforcement agencies collect and analyze and report on their use of force data. And Spokane PD was one of our clients. And before the law, about a quarter of all their use of force were neck restraints. And they trained on it so hard. I mean, they were like, you had to, in order to use the technique, you had to be very well trained.
And they were proficient in it.
And they were very proficient because they used it. They used it a lot, right?
I've been choked out, which is the term.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been put to sleep and I wake up real quickly.
Yeah. If you're an officer and you have to sort of be the test subject and your choice is a taser, pepper spray, or neck restraint, what would you choose?
Neck restraint.
Yeah.
Every time.
Every time. Okay. So, but the legislature said, well, we're banning neck restraints to save lives.
Optics.
How many lives have been saved? None. How many lives have been lost? Probably, 2 or 3 maybe.
And it leads back to why they put this consent decree or settlement agreement into Seattle. Another narrative that is counter to reality and truth.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, our group, United Coalition of Public Safety, we are working with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. And we just want to give a nod to Harmeet Dillon from the DOJ and her congratulations to the city of Seattle getting their police department back. Here she is real quick.
Hi, I'm Harmeet Dillon from the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division with a very important update from Seattle, Washington, where today, after over 13 years, a federal judge has finally ended the consent decree imposed on Seattle's police department by the Obama administration Department of Justice and returned the local control of Seattle's policing to the people of Seattle. This is a great day for Seattle. Congratulations on meeting the court's obligations and the consent decree requirements, and on finally enjoying the freedom of local control, which is something that we at the DOJ really hope for all of our communities in the United States, to keep them safe, free, and under local accountability. Congratulations, Seattle.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, it's awesome. And then it goes to how they're trying to tie in, now SPOG to being MAGA based, right? Trying to paint us as the obstructionists of reform. But now you've got a DOJ that, in my opinion, is leading through truth and accurate statistics to justify consent decrees, not use it as a political weapon. And I just want to credit Harmeet Dillon and her leadership and her team for embarking on this. And they've been pretty successful so far, and hopefully we get the final results we want in terms of reforming the consent decree process.
Yeah, I'm actually hoping that the Civil Rights Division will do much more than they're doing now, because it's a good start. I mean, they initially pulled out of the signed consent decrees in Louisville and Minneapolis, but there's still about a dozen consent decrees. They ended the consent decree in Albuquerque, but that was scheduled to end anyway. It was like 4 months early. And then, Seattle has ended. And of course, they're not going to object to any agency that wants out. But cities like Baltimore and New Orleans and Cleveland are still suffering on a daily basis under federal oversight. And some of the abuses, like the abuses of the monitor in Cleveland that just resigned, I mean, are just horrific. And so what I would hope for the DOJ Civil Rights Division is that they basically audit the whole thing from top to bottom and say, all right, what has the DOJ been doing for the last 30 years? And is there any basis in law or in fact for them to have done what they do? And if they find that there isn't, then they should be going to every single city and saying, all right, these consent decrees were based on fraud and they should be eliminated immediately. Not you're in compliance with the terms of the consent decree. They're all just contracts. This is contract law, right? So if the DOJ and whatever city is party to that contract, if the DOJ and the city want out of that contract, there's nothing a judge or a monitor can do to stop them from doing that.
Yeah.
So I hope that the DOJ takes a much more aggressive stance on consent decrees and not only removing the fraudulent consent decrees that are currently in place, but reforming the whole system so that what we talked about earlier, so that consent decrees actually follow the law and actually mean something and produce the reforms that they say they're going to produce, and only when they're needed.
Amen, Bob. And that's truth right there. And thank you for working with us to help reform that effort, man. It's much needed. So looking at a piece from Hard Pressed by Glenn Stelmacher. We'll put a link in the description, and they're not very happy with this DOJ news for Seattle. And I'll get into some of their quotes. The title is Federal Judge and Seattle PD Oversight. Now what? And there's a few tidbits here, but I'll read just briefly with the link that I just talked about. After Judge James Robart ordered the termination of the consent decree, a gaggle of Seattle Police Department brass and Mayor Harrell gathered for the press outside of the federal courthouse. Noticeably absent at the press scrum were any community members or civil rights organizations. You pointed that out. SPD's federal monitor, Antonio Offley, I always butcher his last name.
Oftelli, I think.
Oftelli, yeah. Sorry, yeah, Antonio, who was sent one last $13,525 check from the federal court on Tuesday, was also noticeably absent and has not even released a statement. Here's a quote from Mayor Harrell. "This is a different department than it was in 2012, Mayor Harrell said to the court. It's a different department than it was in 2020. And then they go back on to just hammer SPOG. As I love it. Judge Robart hammered SPOG about a dozen times in his comments. Thought that was interesting. SPD has certainly changed while under the consent decree. The Seattle Police Officers Guild SPOG leadership is different, now more intertwined ideologically with Trump's MAGA movement, and SPD's current chief, Sean Barnes, who was secretly selected by Harrell without public input, appeared to be in North Carolina in 2020 while SPD officers were carpeting Westlake and Capitol Hill in a carcinogenic chemical suit. And lastly, the ACLU of Washington has had their own thoughts, releasing a statement shortly after Robart closed the consent decree for good. Quote, "The Seattle Police Department is not a transformed institution, and ending the consent decree does not make today's court decision the success the city claims it to be," unquote. That's the DOJ. They go on. "This is not a moment for self-congratulation, but a time for the city leaders in the department to prove they are committed to transparency, oversight, true accountability, and real transformation that centers the needs of communities, particularly those historically targeted by police misconduct," unquote. That is so egregious by the ACLU. And I look at that type of statement. They're clearly not happy. They would be more comfortable with having this agency under the control of DOJ civil rights in perpetuity. But it tells me that the contract negotiations between SPOG and the city is first and on the form, I think, forethought, especially with Judge Robart's comments, that they continue to press for more accountability. And I just want to say, and I've said this before, the police department in the city of Seattle is the most accountable agency in the nation. So why is it that they keep on pressing for more of this? Is it because of the financial connection here where there's a lot of money to be made? Or is it more based on ideology to push an anti-police narrative? Or is it a combination of both?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I sort of straddle across the spectrum, sort of ideologically with what I talk about. But when I talk about things like law enforcement and public safety and consent decrees and pattern practice, the only thing that I'm focused on is data, evidence, facts, truth. And I know that officers screw up, right? I know that they're bad officer involved shootings. Officers should be held accountable. I know that unions, bargain for their members, they're advocates, right?
That's my role.
I mean, I understand how the system works, and I'm pretty much agnostic when it comes to political views on all of this. What really gets me is when people misuse facts or make false statements or base decisions on fabrications. That's what gets my juices flowing.
Yeah.
And so like for example, Glenn, the reporter, you were quoting his story. I've talked to him several times. I think that guy is fantastic. Whether or not I agree with his political views or his comments or whatever else, because he's an investigative journalist.
Yeah.
And he's digging deep. He's doing public records requests. He's getting to the bottom, and he's uncovered some amazing stuff with text messages between police officials and the Monitor. And he's uncovered financial connections between the Monitor and your new police chief. I mean, he's uncovered a lot of stuff.
So basically, he's not so ideologically driven. He's more so, here's the information.
Well, I think the way he writes, he clearly has he has opinions, right? Yeah. He has his own opinions that come across in his writings. But what I like about him is that he's going after the facts. He doesn't misuse facts.
Good. Well, hey, that's all you can applaud, right? Well, I'm glad that you've kind of highlighted that. But that leads me into this guy, Birdman. Mike Carter from the Seattle Times. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. I don't get much, I think, respect for anybody that's got a couple birds on their shoulder that completely throws shade at this union and the police officers that work for the police department. He's particularly gone after you recently in a series of emails because you tell truth. And I think Mike is a bit scared of that, and he doesn't like the fact that you do that. So I guess we're brothers in the sense that Mike Carter hates both of us. And he's not an authentic person.
I'm a jerk and you're delusional.
Yes, exactly. In fact, I should put the quotes on my shoulders, delusional Mike, with a couple birds. I don't think so.
Yeah. Well, let me just give it a little bit of background here. So when I worked for Seattle for 14 years in the early 2000s, I worked on a lot of high profile public safety projects, and I worked on the city council's racial profiling task force and raves and open air drug enforcement, all sorts of stuff. And I was interviewed quite a bit by the media, and usually with the Seattle Times, it was a reporter named Steve Militich.
Yeah.
And I had a good relationship with Steve. I didn't have any problem with Steve. But Mike Carter, I don't think I ever talked to him. And I don't think he ever tried to interview me on anything. So I've never met the guy. I don't really know who he is. But after I left, and I don't think Steve Militich is still with the Times, but after I left Seattle, I would occasionally, catch up on the news about what's happening with Seattle PD and public safety and everything. And it was mostly Mike Carter who was writing the stories. And so he would write a lot of stories about the consent decree. And I knew that what he was writing was not true, or was not accurate.
Or skewed in such an anti-police way.
It was just lopsided.
Awful.
It's like, okay, maybe that's true, but you're ignoring the bigger issue here, which is all this other stuff that is more important. And so not a lot, but probably over the last, 5 years, I may have sent him 4 or 5 emails, basically providing him with information that I thought he should follow up on, because he was writing these stories about the consent decrees and he was ignoring some important things. And so when the mayor's office announced that, the consent decree was going to be lifted, et cetera, he did a press release, and they said that the total cost of the consent decree over the last 13 years was $127 million. And I remembered, and there was a 2023, because there's not a lot of information about costs, right? Because cities don't want to talk about how much it costs for consent decrees, and DOJ certainly doesn't want to talk about it. So it's hard to find that information. But I remembered that in 2023, Mike Carter wrote an article, and in 2023, he said that the costs of the Seattle consent decree have exceeded $200 million back in 2023.
There you go.
All right. And so how is it that in 2023 the cost exceeded $200 million, and today
he reported
this is his report, and today the mayor's saying it's $127 million. So I sent him on Thursday, September 4th, I sent him an email, and I want to read the email because
2 days ago.
You need to hear his response based on this. Is all I sent him. Okay. I said, Mike, in 2023, you did a story on the Seattle consent decree, and you said that the total cost was, quote, more than $200 million, end quote. Now, 2 years later, the mayor's office is claiming that the consent decree has only cost $127 million. However, the Seattle Police Officers Guild says that the consent decree has cost taxpayers $220 million. In your most recent story, you disputed SPOG's cost estimate while backing the mayor's lower figure because the mayor provided you with quote-unquote spreadsheets. Since the city of Seattle is the only source of cost information on the consent decree, I assumed that you got the more than $200 million number from the city back in 2023. I think it would be helpful for the Seattle Times to clarify whether the total cost of the consent decree was, quote, more than $200 million, end quote, as you reported in 2023, or $127 million as you were reporting today. These are very big numbers with significant community impact, so it is important that the Seattle Times reports the correct number. Thanks.
Boom.
Okay.
Truth bomb from Bob Scales and Police Strategies right there to Birdman.
That's it. That's all I wrote. Okay. All right. Mike Carter replies. He replies, let's see, I wrote, sent at 10:01. 20 minutes later, he replies.
Sure.
20 minutes.
It's so good. I mean, I start laughing too. It's so classic Mike Carter.
So Mike Carter, could you be a bigger jerk, Bob? I'm about to correct the 150 million figure to 130 million after further reviewing the mayor's figures. The 200 million came from Durkin, Mayor Jenny Durkin at the time, and was disputed by Harrell, Mayor Harrell, who actually gave me a breakdown. The 150 million is a memory mistake, and I'm going to correct it. As for you, I'm done wasting time talking to you. The Guild also says that FBI stats show Seattle is the fourth most dangerous city in America.
It's true.
They don't, whatever that means. SPOG is delusional. You've been complaining about consent decrees and my reporting for 13 years. You opposed the agreement and defended SPD's indefensible behavior. You discounted DOJ's findings. It's over. Now, what are you going to do? I don't know this guy. I do not know this guy.
He's so laughably awesome. It's incredible how much that guy hates me and how much I return the favor. He's just an anti-police zealot, and he doesn't want to purport the truth. But what's stunning to me is that people actually still read him to a degree.
Well, he seems to be the only one reporting on public safety and consent decrees. But what's interesting in his response too, he's talking about numbers that I never even mentioned. I don't know where he's getting 150 million, 130 million. I mean, he's throwing out other numbers that I didn't even. But
if he claims that the Harrell administration gave him a breakdown, well, then why don't you report on that? Like actually show the breakdown of the numbers.
Exactly.
I mean,
I can give him spreadsheets if he likes spreadsheets. I've got a lot of spreadsheets I can give him.
I mean, and he says that defended by SPD, your take is indefensible. Well, okay, well then defend your numbers then, based upon the breakdown of the numbers. I mean, if it's 2023 that he actually reported in for $200 million, 3 years later, it's north of 220.
Well, what's interesting is back in 2012, the budget office. We asked the budget office, so like, here's the consent decree. What do you think this is going to cost? And the budget office came up with about $15 million a year. And 10 million would be 130 million. 20 million would be 260 million.
Yes.
So it's about right. 15 million was about right.
It's right there.
And what was interesting, here's the other interesting thing. So when we told So DOJ wanted radio silence during the investigation and the negotiations. They didn't want anything leaking out, and we were just like, well, we're accountable to the community and to the public. We have Public Records Act. We can't keep this secret.
Yeah,
and so I can't remember who, but somebody told the press that the city estimates that it would cost $15 million a year. DOJ went ballistic.
Did they?
You're trying to sabotage the negotiations. There's no way it will cost that much. Sure enough, it was a pretty good estimate for our budget office.
And it's interesting how they're circling the wagons and how much money it costs now. Right?
Oh yeah. Oh, it's not that expensive. It's really
Whatever.
good.
I mean, so lastly with the Times, and again, I don't read the Times. I only get some snippets of it. It's just hilarity. There was an op-ed that came out, I think, a couple of days ago that you want to just touch on real quick. That's based upon complete, I think, inaccurate information.
Yeah, it's an op-ed that was written coincidentally the day after the consent decree was lifted. So
they're all circling the wagons to just do this kumbaya. Hey, this is great.
Seems like I don't think this was written in a few hours. It seems like they knew what was going to happen.
It was all canned.
Right? And the title of it is, "We Negotiated the SPD Consent Decree. Here's what comes next." And it was written by Mike Diaz, Thomas Bates, Jonathan Smith, who were all former DOJ officials and all of whom I worked with during the investigation and negotiations of the consent decree. And pretty much everything in this op-ed is false, misleading, completely disingenuous. And not once do they mention in this 3-page op-ed the term pattern or practice,
which was their verbiage with justifying the consent decree here in 2011.
What they say is, the consent decree was so good because officer injuries went down.
That's false.
Use of force went down. And here, I mean, this is the number I love.
The reason why use of force went down is, yes, because the policies were so restrictive that cops are too afraid to go hands-on now. And now you've got all this anti-police energy, and the new hires mostly have been taught, don't go hands-on. And they're afraid to go hands-on.
Yeah.
Or reluctant. I shouldn't say afraid, reluctant.
And I think the biggest reason, so here's the thing. So here's what they say in their op-ed. By 2016, serious use of force had dropped by 60% compared to 2009. And from that point to 2021, uses of all force fell another 48%. Wow, that's okay. So they never once mention excessive, unnecessary, or unconstitutional uses of force. That's all that matters.
Why do you think that is? Because they're trying to protect themselves?
Because they don't have any evidence that you had a pattern or practice.
Still to this day.
There's no evidence that you're doing anything wrong in terms of a pattern or practice.
Bob, right? You're being anti-reform right now.
Yeah, I know. but the funny thing is that I think, okay, so I did a study when I was still, because after the consent decree went into place, the Mayor McGinn at the time appointed me to be the compliance coordinator in SPD. And so my job was to work with DOJ and the monitor on all the reforms. And I also worked with the Community Police Commission. And so one of the questions was, we heard a lot about depolicing and disengagement and that stops were going down and everything else. And so I did a little study, and what we found is that arrests for nonviolent misdemeanors since the investigation started, were down by more than 90%.
90%.
Yeah. Yeah. And so basically, in the park after dark, sit, lie, drunk and disorderly, all those kind of things, right? 90% drop. And I presented that report to the Community Police Commission. I didn't say, oh, it's because of the consent decree. I just said, look, this is the data, right? That you need to be aware that this is what's happening. It's undisputed what the data is. I got it from the municipal court, from our own police records. This is the data. And Jenny Durkin, who was the U.S. attorney at the time, did a press conference. And the press conference was about getting the officer's lawsuit against the use of force policy dismissed. And so at the press conference, she said, oh, and by the way, there's this report that talks about, the drop in enforcement. And this is a piece of garbage. This is not a report that anybody would rely on, and you should just ignore it. And so, but there have been studies and reports about most notably Roland Fryer from Harvard University, economist, that talks about the impacts, the public safety impacts of consent decrees. And what happens is, in every single case where you've got an increase in violent crime and particularly homicides after a consent decree goes into place. And the reason people say, and I agree with, is that the DOJ, the monitor, and the judge basically create this massive disincentive for proactive policing, because you're told as an officer, we don't want you to use force. We don't want you to get any complaints. We don't want you to make any arrests and make any stops.
That's right.
And if you just keep your head down, just stay out of trouble, and just punch your time card, and everything will be fine.
Yeah, it discourages proactivity. But now I find it interesting is that the community, and I witnessed this last night at a candidate forum for, elected positions. The mayor was there. His person that's running against him, Katie Wilson. Here's the picture, link in the description. The community, it seemed, wanted more police, wanted proactivity.
Absolutely.
Because crime's out of control. But the problem is that the burdensome of these policies and the political ideology, the march for this criminal justice reform based on politics, has infused itself into public safety, and cops are worried about their well-being, their legal freedom. And so it's led to this lack of proactivity. Cops don't feel as if they're going to be supported to arrest people. Your statistics, to me, prove that that's the case, right?
Yeah. Well, when the consent decree started, you had 1,300 sworn officers. How many do you have now?
We only have about 830 deployable cops.
Right. So you're down 500 officers.
Well, I would say 700, but
yeah,
a
lot,
a
huge percentage. All right, fewer officers, fewer arrests. Disincentives for proactive policing. The reason use of force is down so much is because you're not doing anything.
That's right.
Right?
Absolutely. There it is.
Yeah,
That's the absolute truth, and nobody in media is going to actually say that besides podcasts like this. So that's why I think it's incredibly important that people consume this and share it. Lastly, I do want to say about Federal Judge Robart, I want to be respectful of the bench. But I'm witnessing this in the courtroom a few days ago, and I mentioned him earlier in the pod, and it just sparked my memory. It's like he's talking about the contract SPOG and making sure that the then 2017 accountability ordinance gets put into collective bargaining. And I've been in that process in terms of opining on it in this podcast. We're currently bargaining that at the table. But he couldn't even mention OPA, Office of Police Accountability, properly. He's been in charge of this consent decree process for 13 years. He referred to OPA as the Office of Professional Responsibility every time he mentioned it. And I'm sitting there looking at this guy who has an opinion. He's throwing shade at guys like you, people that were questioning the consent decree, throwing SPOG under the bus. And I'm like, this guy couldn't even get the basic fundamentals of who the players are at the table in his public comments. So like, how do we take what he has to say with a grain, like with based in any form of what would you call it, reasonableness or fairness?
Yeah, I mean, federal judges overseeing consent decrees are a whole podcast in and of themselves. And I just want to point out a couple of things. Federal judges understand federal law, rules of evidence, courtroom procedures. That's their job, right? They rule on objections. They rule on motions. That's their job, right? That's what they're experts in. They know absolutely nothing about public safety, law enforcement, running a police department. Absolutely nothing.
Yeah, but he had the gall to basically opine upon our crowd control efforts in 2020.
Exactly.
I mean,
He vetoed.
Our cops
he
then
vetoed
saved
city
our
council
cops,
ordinance.
Yeah, well, thank God he did. That was the only thing he
I know,
basically
but
did right.
This is the thing, is that this is where I'm like, I don't care what the outcome is. I just care if like he had no legal authority to do that. Right. So even though the outcome was good,
but I guess he put it into the use of force component of the consent decree, which gave him the justification in his mind.
Yeah, he has no. And here's one thing. So there's only one judge that I'm aware of. It was a Solano County Superior Court judge. The California DOJ did a consent decree with Vallejo PD, and they took it before the Solano County judge. And he said, "What the hell is this? I'm not signing this. This isn't my job. I'm not going to spend the next decade of my career managing
with
your police
case.
department." So they couldn't find a judge that would take it.
But
right?
but Judge Robart decided to do
it.
And
here's the other thing. Here's another little scandal, or big scandal. So in 2016, Tarleton University and another university worked with the judge in overseeing the New Orleans consent decree, and they created an annual consent decree conference.
This is great.
So all the judges overseeing consent decrees, all the DOJ attorneys involved in this, all the monitors would get together at this secret conference in Texas every year to discuss pending litigation. Every consent decree is pending litigation. It's litigation filed in the court, and it's active. So they're judges, attorneys, monitors, all talking about their consent decrees and how to improve the consent decree process. That's all unethical. That's a violation of judicial canons of ethics, right? You cannot have all these ex parte conversations. You cannot get together with judges and say, "Hey, I got this case. It's similar to your case. Maybe we can collaborate."
Sure.
And I can tell you how to manage New Orleans, and you can tell me how to manage
So I guess
Seattle.
what you're describing, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like just how the former police chiefs are intertwined with the federal monitors in this whole consent decree conversation. It appears that it continues with judges who are in charge of these consent decrees in whatever city you want to go to, most of them blue cities. And that seems to be a conflict of interest is what you're describing.
Absolutely. And judges obviously aren't making money off of this, but if you've got a lifetime appointment to the federal bench and all you do day in and day out is listen to attorneys talk and rule on motions, what a boring job. Hey, would you like to run the Seattle Police Department for the next decade? Hey, that would be fun.
So it's a bit of a stroke of the ego, for sure.
It's a power. It's a power political.
Well, I definitely saw that play out in his public remarks. It's part of the dance, the game, if you will.
Yep.
So, hey, Bob, how do people get in touch with you? How do they follow you? Where can they go?
Yeah, so I've got a consulting business. It's Police Strategies LLC. It's www.policestrategies.com. I'm at bob@policestrategies.com for an email. And, I do a lot of stuff on LinkedIn where I complain about a lot of stuff and and data and racial disparity analysis and but I am sort of, I'm hoping that I can, work with you guys at UCops and do something really, really cool.
Get some work done and reform the consent decree for perpetuity.
I mean, it is literally a once in a lifetime opportunity. I mean, this will never happen again. So I'm hoping we can make it happen.
Yeah, I credit Pam Bondi, Department of Justice, particularly with Harmeet Dillon's leadership in the Civil Rights Division to get that done. It's really, I'm thankful that we're partnered with them to do that because it's important.
Yeah.
And your leadership, you've stepped into the breach here against this onslaught of media calling you out. Your work.
Well, it's just Mike Carter.
Well, whatever. I mean, it's media. It's legacy media that corporate media, they're not interested in telling the truth, in my opinion.
Most media just ignores me, right? I mean, it's like I've tried to raise. I mean, and I've gone to local media in other cities with consent decrees and say, hey, look, you need to know what's happening here.
And that's a podcast by itself, and they just don't seem to care. That's why the constituents, like at that forum last night, they just want cops. They want cops to be cops, and they don't understand how much of this energy of anti-police sentiment based on politics has infused the public safety conversation and hindered their quality of life. They want a cop to clean up Aurora. But it's very difficult to do that based upon the policies that are put in place. And the cops feel as if, hey, if I be proactive here, I'm going to get thrown under the bus. I could potentially lose my job, be thrown in jail. That is real.
And that's the thing is that when Phoenix came under investigation, the union there brought me down, and they said, "Hey, why don't you come down and talk to our officers and talk to our community members, talk to our elected officials?" And I just told them my experience in Seattle, and nobody could believe it. It's like because they were everybody trusts the DOJ. Everybody's like, well, DOJ's coming in; they're not going to screw us over, right? They're going to help us. They're here to help.
Newsflash. Well, that's why I think the leadership now is open to feedback and course correction.
Like I said, once in a lifetime opportunity. It's never going to happen again.
Fantastic, and everybody that throws shade at them is not based, in my opinion. So, Bob, I want to thank you again for being on the Hold the Line with Mike Solan. It's such a pleasure to work with you, man, and for your courage and leadership. I want to thank you for that.
Well, and I really like, I mean, again, it's like I try to not be political. And so the fact that you're, I mean, I remember when I was in the mayor's office, we would always complain about SPOG, right?
Sure.
SPOG this, and we'd read The Guardian, and it's like, da-da-da-da. But it's like, this is what it's all about, right? This is like putting out information, putting out facts, putting out truth, and people don't know what's going on. And so if it wasn't for podcasts like yours, I mean, like especially like people in SPD, probably most people in SPD don't know what's going on with the consent decree.
Yeah, that's right. And you nailed it. It's about information, and this is an information war. Everything in public safety, anything political. You've got the battle, the exposure of legacy media, how they're not really telling you the truth. And I think people are waking up. And I think your participation on podcasts like this, working with UCops, working with other groups to get truth out there, to reform the process, to capture the narrative back based on truth and reality, I think is quite compelling. And people are waking up, which I find very heartening. And if we can continue to do this, push back against local media, always question what they're putting out there because they're not, in my opinion, telling you.
Well, also the other thing I try to like always keep in mind is that literally we're all on the same team, right? Yeah. We're all on the same page. Nobody's out there saying, I want to do unconstitutional policing. I've never heard SPOG or any police officer say, in fact, I just want to go bust heads. I don't care about the law.
In fact, if that
else.
happened, we'd be the first ones to
exactly.
say, no,
that's a liability for you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're still unpacking the accountability conversation right now at the bargaining table.
Sure.
I mean, it's stunning to me that the march continues.
Yeah.
Fine. Let's bargain it. Let's see what happens. But media, tell the truth, and maybe you won't be losing so many viewerships or reads in your slanted opinion pieces. So if we can all do that, support your local police department, engage in alternative forms of media such as this podcast. Please like and subscribe, share, get on our X at SPOG 1952 or at United Cops. Follow Bob at Police Strategies. We all do those basic things. Stand up for quality of life and common sense. We can continue to hold the line. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the weekend.